One of the top secrets to success almost nobody talks about is the power of clear, rational thinking. However, our brain is literally programmed to suppress this kind of thinking, dooming us to be blinded from the truth and live a below-average life. But over my years as a peer-reviewed researcher in the behavioral sciences and as an entrepreneur, I've discovered 3 mental frameworks we can use to override this programming and help us transform into powerful thinkers and leaders. And these 3 frameworks are 1. The SURFPAD concept, 2. Assimilation versus accommodation, and 3. The Interactionist model of reasoning. And these are explained at length in the excellent book How Minds Change by David McRaney. Let's take a look at number 1 here. As McRaney explains, the simplest way to understand the SURFPAD concept is by taking a look at a viral online post called The Dress, which back in 2016 forced people to take radically different sides and even garnered mainstream media and celebrity attention. And here's that post. Now, take a look at the dress. What colors do you see? Well, you might be surprised to know that people's answers end up being one of 2 extremely different ones. One group of people will look at this photo and tell you they see black and blue colors, that's me, and yet another group of people will look at this same photo and tell you they see white and gold. Which ones do you see? Well, McRaney delves deep into the science of why different people can look at the same image yet come to extremely different conclusions. And as he explains, the science behind this phenomenon is essentially the same as the science behind why we disagree upon anything at all, whether that's religion, politics, or major life and career decisions. Therefore, if we truly understand this phenomenon, we can avoid accidentally engaging in self-deception and put ourselves in greater control of our thoughts and decisions. The reason 2 people can look at this photo and see 2 different sets of colors, McRaney explains, has nothing to do with the way the light waves interact with our eyes and brain, but instead with what are called our priors. You see, we all have past experiences. We're from a particular country, speak a particular language, have grown up in a rural place or an urban place, work in a certain industry or went to a certain school, and throughout our lives, our brains work to identify patterns and make predictions that are useful for our survival. And it filters out anything else that is irrelevant to that goal. And so, in short, the brain does not perceive objective reality. It doesn't perceive truth. Instead, it perceives only the reality relevant to its survival. That's why bumblebees see ultraviolet light and we can't. It's why bats use sonar to see and we can't. And it's why the world of a dog is a world where pretty much every object has a smell. But not only can't we access these worlds, in a very real sense, we can't even conceive of what these realities would be like. But as we can see with the example of the dress, these different realities exist even among different human beings. For instance, have you ever had a conversation with someone that held what you thought was a ridiculous belief and you just couldn't even conceive of how they could think that way? Well, the reason for this, according to McRaney, it's what researchers call SURFPAD, which stands for substantial uncertainty with ramified or forked priors or assumptions, therefore disagreement. I know, a mouthful. In other words, if we start with different priors, or what you can think of as different assumptions, as our inputs, we will inevitably disagree, even when we have the same objective evidence literally right in front of our eyes. In the case of the dress, the reason researchers have hypothesized as to why different groups tend to see different colors seems to depend on whether they spend more time exposed to artificial light or natural sunlight. In other words, your brain literally uses your own assumptions of what the dress should look like to generate the colors you actually see. The key point to understand here, though, in a way, both groups are right and both groups are wrong. In some very real sense, just as we can't perceive the realities that different animals perceive, there is some overarching reality or truth here. Everything, as my dog Athena would say, does actually have a smell, even if we humans can't even conceive of a world like that. The overarching truth here is, it isn't that the truth doesn't exist. It's just that no one of us can perceive that entire truth. So then if our brain is distorting our perception of truth, then what can we do about it? Well, as McCraney explains, we can adjust what we've referred to before as our priors, or simply put, we can adjust the assumptions and expectations we've generated from our past experiences. Which brings us to the second key framework from this book: assimilation versus accommodation. Although, as we've seen, it's impossible to make our brains perceive the entire truth, it's this framework of assimilation and accommodation that at least helps us to gradually expand the amount of truth we can perceive. And the more we can expand our perception of truth, the better decisions we can make in our lives. In order to expand our mind this way, let's first address an important question, namely, what's the true source of our priors in the first place? As McCraney, as well as many other researchers in social psychology have explained, it's our identity, which is ultimately determined and shaped by whatever group we see ourselves as a part of. When we say that our brains are programmed to help us survive, that includes social survival. In fact, as McCraney points out, that often means we will even sacrifice ourselves for the survival of the group. And this is all because this kind of behavior helps us humans as a whole pass on our genes, what Richard Dawkins calls the selfish gene, to the next generation. But this behavior also has obvious drawbacks. Whereas the process of natural selection has instilled in us the goal of simply surviving, in our modern society, we no longer want to live simply to survive and reproduce. Instead, if we see our purpose as individuals as greater than this, as desiring, for instance, fulfillment and happiness, we must somehow learn to surpass our immediate biological drives. And that's where assimilation and accommodation come in. Assimilation is a process that preserves our mental model and priors, and accommodation is a process that updates them. For instance, imagine you believe in a conspiracy that evil lizard people from another dimension are manipulating world events, and in particular, they recently caused some horrible assassination to occur. When you hear about the news of the assassination, you immediately conclude, aha, the evil lizards did that. But imagine that another person then points out to you that there is actually evidence contradicting your conclusion, such as that the police caught the assassin and determined he acted alone. Well, an example of assimilation here would be you concluding that the fact that the police caught the assassin and made the conclusion they made is yet more evidence of the conspiracy. Do you see what you did here mentally? You acted out of a sort of self-defense here to maintain your mental model by forcing the facts to fit your reality instead of the other way around. And we all do this, not just people who believe in evil interdimensional lizards. In fact, ask yourself, in what aspect of your life are you engaging in assimilation right now? Whether that's to maintain a dying relationship, to convince yourself to stay in that career you hate, or whatever. Well, the solution is accommodation. Accommodation would look like the opposite. Noticing the new piece of information, what McCraney calls an anomaly, and updating our model of reality accordingly. But he points out this can only happen if tons of these so-called anomalies build up over time to the point that we can no longer maintain our mental model. So for instance, exposing you to this fact that the police caught the assassin probably wouldn't be enough to help you change your mind. You would have to be exposed to anomaly after anomaly after anomaly until you reach a critical point. However, to help you avoid biased thinking and reasoning, this alone might not be enough, which is why we need to look at our third framework here, which is the Interactionist model of reasoning. By acknowledging that we cannot conceive of the entirety of reality by ourselves, just as a bat or dog can't perceive the reality of each other, as we'll see, this framework helps us to even further expand the amount of truth and reality we can perceive. The beliefs we form and priors and mental models we maintain due to our group identity, as we've seen, are very strong. Accommodation is a helpful process for guiding us and carefully evaluating the truth and reasoning more clearly. But in order to truly become independent thinkers who exercise control over our lives, we need to evaluate how the groups we belong to influence our identity, our priors, and our resulting decisions and actions. What nation do you belong to, and how does that influence your assumptions? What is your race, gender, religion, sexuality, etc., and how does that all influence your assumptions? What industry do you work in? What's your educational background? Your political affiliation? What other groups do you belong to? list them all out. McRaney points to research showing that if there's a belief we are afraid to question because destroying that belief inevitably means destroying that piece of our identity, then we can appeal to one or another group we belong to create the feeling of security required for us to make that leap. For instance, back when I was making the transition from being purely an academic to getting into sales and entrepreneurship, two worlds that couldn't be more different, I felt really uneasy about the decision. I felt like I was destroying that academic piece of my identity, and I felt as if I was jumping into an abyss without knowing whether there was a net below to catch me. I was losing a part of myself. But interestingly, what helped me through that period was to realize that my economics professor at the time had also gotten involved in the business world, and in fact, I came to meet a few more people on my journey who had both business and academic backgrounds, and my connection to these people made me feel more confident about my decision. But the interactionist model of reasoning isn't just about identifying different groups we belong to in order to more easily transition from one set of beliefs to another. Instead, it's about engaging in what McRaney calls street epistemology. And it's street epistemology that helps us truly reach our potential to see the entire truth. The German philosopher and social theorist Jürgen Habermas claims that seeking truth is only possible through interaction with others, and in particular through what he calls the ideal speech situation, in which the goal of our interaction with others is not persuasion, but instead simply understanding. And once again, if we consider our previous examples of bats using sonar, dogs perceiving everything to have a smell, and bumblebees' ability to see ultraviolet light, we can begin to understand how our interactions with others, rather than isolating ourselves comfortably alone in our own rooms, can help us begin to grasp these little pieces and perspectives that make up the entirety of reality and truth. And this is kind of what street epistemology is, except McRaney has laid out the process in explicit steps. The steps in this process are a bit too much to go into in this video, but I've listed them on the screen here, and the main goal of these steps is not persuasion at all. Instead, when done correctly, it's a method of conversation that both participants can use to uncover hidden assumptions in our beliefs and improve our reasoning process by doing something that's pretty genius. Through this conversational method, we force our brains to consider how the facts and evidence are relevant to our own lives, thereby ironically bypassing our emotional fight or flight response and allowing us to see things more objectively. For instance, researchers designed a study to determine what kinds of marketing content was most convincing, and they divided the content into two types. One type of content took what they called the central route, meaning the marketing focused on facts, logic, and data, and the other type of content took what they called the peripheral route, meaning the marketing focused on emotions and third-party testimonials. Participants were split into two groups, Group A and Group B, both of whom watched both types of marketing content. Group A was given content that was personally relevant to them as students. It was presented as material relevant to their studies, without which they would not be able to graduate. Group B was given no personally relevant incentive at all. And the results weren't what you might expect. While Group B was more convinced by the content that used emotion and third-party testimonials, and less convinced by the content that used facts, logic, and data, the reverse was true of Group A. Because they had a personal interest in the content, they were highly focused and interested in the facts and logic presented, and totally dismissed the emotionally driven content. How can we use this in our everyday thinking? Well, let's suppose you're thinking of transitioning into a new career and out of your current one you hate, and you see a cool opportunity pop up on your social media feed, but you want to evaluate it to see if it's the career or opportunity that will finally allow you to transition. Well, for this or any given opportunity you're considering getting into, define a clearly desired outcome for yourself, such as, for example, that you really want to work 20 hours per week remotely with flexible hours. Once you define a clearly relevant goal for yourself like this, and the more specific it is, the less likely you are to buy into what will now be irrelevant testimonials, personal stories, or emotional appeals. If you lack the goal, you might be more likely to weigh those emotionally driven tactics positively into your decision-making process. But by making a goal that's personally relevant to you from the outset, you can more easily avoid bias. How can you use some of the principles we've covered in this video in your own life? What traps have we covered that you've been falling into, and what steps will you take first to get out of them? If you want to keep leveling up your critical thinking to make a massive impact, not only on your own life, but on the lives of countless others, then be sure to watch this next video.